This is Ben Plutinsky, managing editor of City Journal. I'm here with contributing editor Heather McDonald. Heather, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
Heather, your latest story for the new issue of City Journal is entitled, "Is the Criminal Justice System Racist?" Now that proposition, the idea that the criminal justice system is in fact racist, is widely accepted in some quarters, probably because of a statistic that you cite early on, that though blacks are only 13% of the American population, they're nearly 38% of the population of prisons nationwide. To that question, Heather, the question of how can this possibly be if the criminal justice system isn't racist, what would you respond?
The criminal justice system is reacting to crime, Ben, and unfortunately, the black crime rate is as disproportionate, if not more so, for homicide than the black incarceration rate. Homicide rates are about 7 times higher for blacks than for whites and most Hispanics combined. And violent crime rates are about 3 times higher for blacks than, say, their representation in the population. So when you actually look at how the criminal justice system is working from the start of policing through prosecution decisions, through judging decisions, sentencing decisions, it turns out that the system responds to crime, the heinousness of crime, and people's criminal records.
Well, there's a response that I might imagine someone making to that, which is, yeah, sure, it seems that blacks commit a disproportionate share of the crime in this country, but isn't it possibly that our statistics are biased as well? That's because police officers arrest too many blacks because the police are racist? Is it because prosecutors overcharge blacks and judges over-sentence them? Could that be why there are more blacks in prison than their representation in the population would suggest?
Well, the ACLU has perfected that argument, and they argue incessantly that the police are ignoring white crime because they're so obsessed with blacks. And at least for violent crime, that argument simply does not hold water. All the way back in '78, there was a study in Georgia, of all places, that found that the race of criminals as reported by the victims of crime matched that of the arrests that the police were making. And that study, that type of study, has been repeated again and again. And even very, very liberal criminologists like Robert Sampson or Michael Tonry have admitted that the incarceration rate reflects black crime, not the racist criminal justice system, but that message never seems to penetrate the activist consciousness, the media consciousness, and the public consciousness. And the same issue applies. You're right, the argument is made with sentencing, that prosecutors are exercising their discretion and selectively prosecuting blacks. Again, the evidence just doesn't show this. In fact, in some cases, some Justice Department studies have found that blacks are actually under convicted for certain crimes, and where it shows that their sentences are longer than whites for similar crimes, it turns out that if you take into account individuals' criminal records, that explains the disparity.
Now, there's another argument that you go into some detail in your study that has to do with drug penalties. There are two facts that you cite that seem on the face of them sort of damning. The first is that the federal penalties for crack cocaine are much more severe than those for powder cocaine. And the second, that in, I think, 2006, 81% of federal crack defendants were black, while just 27% of federal powder cocaine defendants were black. So the argument you hear, if I understand it right, is that since penalties for crack are more severe, and since blacks are much likelier to be crack defendants than powder cocaine defendants, that suggests some sort of bias built into the system as well.
Yeah, this is the favorite argument of the media. So much ink has been spilled on the federal crack penalties. It's unbelievable. We must be running out. And the facts you cite are correct. The 80% approximately of federally prosecuted crack defendants are black, and the penalties are 100 times higher for the amounts of 5 grams of crack will yield you the same minimum 5-year sentence as 500 grams of powder. But here's the catch, Ben. Turns out that every year there's about 5,000 federal crack defendants. This comes nowhere close to accounting for the 800,000 black prisoners in prisons, jails, and federal and state facilities. So it just is an irrelevant factor. The other thing that has to be pointed out is the federal prison system holds just 12% of the nation's prisoners. So again, the vast bulk of black prisoners are in state prisons, and they're there for violence and property crimes.
Okay. One last argument that you address and debunk in your story is that it's prison itself that causes disproportionate incarceration. Isn't the argument that because there are so many black men in prison, this leaves neighborhoods devoid of black men who might serve as role models for other black men who then get put into prison, and the whole thing becomes a kind of deadly cycle? Is that right?
Right. This is a popular argument now. Jeffrey Fagan at Columbia Law School has made it. But there's no empirical evidence that, the people that are committing enough crimes, which is a lot, to end up in prison were role models for their children. Were they even living with their children? And is this the sort of role model that people, young kids, can take positive values from? It turns out that New York City did not turn around until the 1990s, the late 1990s, when you had the prison population reaching its zenith. In the late 60s and early 70s, when we had very loose incarceration policies, and we were basically emptying the prisons in the theory that you could only solve crime by solving root causes like poverty and racism. That's when the cities were struggling the most. So it seems to me that there's a certain interesting logical quality to this argument, but empirically, I think the evidence just doesn't back it up.
Well, thanks very much, Heather. Heather McDonald's story, Is the Criminal Justice System Racist?, can be read on City Journal's website, city-journal.org. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben.